to the final session. And one of the most interesting things about this, the 100th anniversary of this disease, is that we actually know something about the patient on whom this, who was among the people on whom this diagnostic category was built. And so what we'd like to do is preface our final session of the afternoon with a reading of extracts from the clinical dialogue between Alois Alzheimer and Augusta Dieter, the patient whose case Alzheimer described and published in a brief article 100 years ago. Alzheimer will be read by Peter Whitehouse, whom you've gotten to know over the last couple of days, and Augusta Dieter will be read by Ruth Yedden, retired faculty member from Penn State's School of Theater Arts. And we have this dialogue because a German psychiatrist, Konrad Maurer, who works in the same Frankfurt clinic where Alzheimer practiced, searched for several years in the basement of the clinic and finally found the original case file. So the words you're about to hear are from the English translation of Dr. Maurer's biography of Alzheimer, and they were originally the clinical notes penned by Alzheimer himself concerning this case. And I'm going to invite Eric Engstrom, since we have an expert on German psychiatry, to come up and say a few words to kind of give us the setting for this exchange.
Thank you very much. This will be a bit of setting, but also sort of a bit of audience prepping, if you will. Peter's given me sort of the impossible task of moving the mountains of your perceptions or preconceptions about German doctors. And one of the ideas I was walking around campus this afternoon and thinking about how to sort of deal with that, and one of the ideas I happened upon was to do what Ann Basting did last night and sort of let's free associate about it. And if I did that, I think we'd get a pretty ominous picture of what German doctors are in your minds. Okay.
No farther than Dr. McElroy.
Yeah. Right. But I've been living in Germany for going on 25 years now, and so I've had some opportunities to sort of observe and compare how preconceptions arise and what people sort of bring to Germany and German doctors. And it's not that those preconceptions are wrong, it's just that they're not always that deep and not always that rich. And so I guess my role right now is to sort of maybe try and complicate your viewing pleasure in some sense. And I'd like to do that by inviting you to take a few just bits of information with you as you go into as you watch this dialogue that you're about to hear. And the key to theater is, of course, that you need to suspend your disbelief. Okay, we are now in a Frankfurt hospital around 1901, and so there are a lot of beds around here, a lot of nurses running around. There's a daily routine installed, and so on and so forth. And what I'd like to do is just sort of juxtapose a few facts to take with you, so that you can have in the back of your mind when you hear this dialogue. Augusta Dieter was one of about 300 patients in the Frankfurt Asylum. Alzheimer was one of 3 doctors in the same asylum. Alzheimer was independently wealthy. Augusta Dieter came from a petit bourgeois background. Alois Alzheimer was raised in Catholic Bavaria. Augusta Dieter was raised in Protestant Prussia. Alois Alzheimer's wife was Jewish. Augusta Dieter's husband was a railway clerk. As this dialogue takes place, Alois Alzheimer has just lost his wife. Augusta Dieter believes that her husband has been unfaithful to her.
Augusta Dieter's sudden onset of symptoms began in March 1901. She became suspicious, then paranoid and delusional, suffered memory loss, became restless, gradually disoriented and agitated, perseverational. Unable to care for her at home, her husband, a railroad clerk, finally brought her in November 1901 to the Asylum for the Insane and Epileptic in Frankfurt, where she was admitted as a third-class public expense patient. Dr. Alowitz Alzheimer, senior physician at the asylum, followed her case with special interest. The relatively early onset of her symptoms of senile dementia, she was 51 at the time of admission, might help him to understand the role of age and genetic predisposition in what he originally took to be an arteriosclerotic process. The first of these interviews takes place on the day of her admission, November 26, 1901.
What is your name?
Augusta.
Family name?
Augusta.
What is your husband's name?
I believe Augusta.
Your husband?
Oh, my husband.
Are you married?
To Augusta.
Mrs. Dieter?
Yes, to Augusta Dieter.
How long have you been here?
3 weeks.
What do I have in my hand?
A cigar.
Right. What do I have in my hand?
A pencil.
Thank you. And that?
A steel nib pen.
Right again. What is that, Mrs. Dieter?
Your purse, doctor.
Yes, right. And that?
A book.
And what is lying next to my notebook?
A bunch of keys.
What does it consist of?
Individual keys.
3 days later, November 29, 1901. After physically harassing other patients, Augusta Dieter is placed in an isolation room where she behaves quite calmly. When Alzheimer comes in, she is lying helplessly in bed.
How are you?
It all comes to the same thing. So who brought me here?
Where are you?
At the moment, I have temporarily, as I said, I don't have means. One had to just, I don't know myself. I don't know at all. Oh, goodness gracious. What is it all about?
What is your name?
Mrs. Dieter, Augusta.
When were you born?
1800 and...
In which year were you born?
1800 and... This year, no, past year.
When were you born?
1800. I don't know.
What did I ask you?
Oh, D. Augusta, the Dieter.
Do you have children?
Yes, a doctor.
What is her name?
Tekla.
How old is she?
She's married in Berlin. Mrs. Wilke.
Where does she live?
We live in Kassel.
Where does your daughter live?
Waldemarstrasse? No, different.
What is your husband's name?
Don't know.
What name does your husband have?
My husband isn't here right now.
What is your husband's name?
Augusta, Wilhelm, Karl. I don't know if I should state it like that.
What is your husband?
Clerk. So mixed up. I'm so mixed up. I can't.
How long have you been here?
2 days probably.
Where are you?
That's probably Wilhelmstrasse.
Where is your apartment?
Well, down Frankfurt.
On which street?
Not Waldemarstrasse. It's another, but wait a moment. I'm so very, very
Are you ill?
downward. They're closer to the spine.
Do you know me?
I believe you have already treated me twice. No, excuse me. I can't.
What year are we living in?
1800.
Which month?
Second month.
What are the names of the months?
January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December.
What does a pound of meat cost?
70.
70 what?
I don't know.
A roll?
3 pennies.
2 times 3.
6.
9 times 7.
63.
12 times 19.
48.
4 times 12.
48.
If you buy 6 eggs, that's 7 pfennigs each. What does that make?
Poaching.
Which street do you live on?
I can't tell you that. I just have to wait a moment.
What did I ask you?
So, that is Frankfurt.
On which street do you live?
Can't tell you. Waldemarstrasse. No,
When did you get married?
don't know that at the moment. Indeed, the woman lives on the same corridor.
Which woman?
The woman where we live, Mrs. Hensler. Mrs. Hensler. Mrs. Hensler.
Augusta Dieter sits in bed helplessly, with a fearful expression. When Alzheimer enters the room, she regarded him suspiciously. During the conversation, she is tearful and reflects on her answers for a long time.
You do not seem happy to see me at all.
Why?
I don't know. We didn't have debts or anything like that. I'm just nervous. You can't take offense at that.
What is your name?
It's Mrs. Augusta Dieter.
What are you?
Mrs. Augusta Dieter.
How old are you?
51.
Where do you live?
Birthday in Kassel.
Where do you live?
Of course, you've already been in our house. Only I was only so nervous.
Where do you live?
Meerfelder's Landstrasse.
Right. What year is it now?
One moment. I'm so nervous. So how old am I? 51.
What month is it?
The 6th? No. 51. Yes, doctor. What have I done then? Just tell me.
What is today's date?
51. No, I am a bit nervous. Is that so bad, doctor? I don't know about anything.
What day of the week is it?
65. Oh, God, I used to be much better at sums.
How long have you been here already?
51.
How long have you been here?
Oh, where do we live? Meerfelder's Landstrasse.
Which city are we in?
Kassel. Here, Kassel. No, Frankfurt.
What kind of a building are you in?
That is, oh God, 51. So, 51.
What brought you here?
I actually don't know that. So, 51. 1851.
What do you mean by that?
51. And
Who are the people in your neighborhood?
also in Meerfelder Landstrasse, or?
Who are the people in your neighborhood?
Oh, I don't even know all the people at all.
Where were you 8 days ago?
8 days ago. They say I can't remember.
Where were you a month ago?
Yes, that I can't say.
Where were you last Christmas?
Yes, I can't tell you that so precisely. 51. I still have to remember that first.
Are you sad?
Oh, always. Mostly not. It happens that one sometimes has courage.
Are you sick?
I can't actually say. I'm sorry enough to, as I said, oh, God.
Are you persecuted?
Oh, no. By God, no.
Are you mocked?
Oh, no. Definitely, I would not say that.
Do you hear voices?
Yes, you've already said that to me.
Do you hear voices?
Oh, yes, so humming, perhaps.
What hums?
It doesn't occur to me like that.
Are you married?
I believe I am married.
Are you married?
Certainly. I have a 52-year-old daughter in Berlin.
How old are you?
56.
And your daughter is supposed to be 52 years old?
53, 54.
If you are 56 years old, then your daughter cannot, of course, be 52 years old.
53, right, is what she is.
If you are 6 years old, then your daughter cannot, of course, be 52 years old.
I'm so nervous. 53 is what I am.
Recite the alphabet.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J.
Go on. Don't other letters come after J?
I don't know anymore.
Do you know the names of the months? January. How does it go after that?
I cannot remember anything.
Alzheimer's last entry in the files of Augusta Dieter dates from June 1902.
Augusta D. continues to be hostile, screams and lashes out when one wants to examine her. She also screams spontaneously, often for hours, so she has to be kept in bed. As far as food is concerned, she no longer keeps to the regular meal times. A boil has formed on her back.
Alzheimer's last conversation with Augusta Dieter is well documented.
Good day, Mrs. Dieter.
Oh, be gone, Richard!
Thanks to Peter and Ruth Yetman. Thank you. Well, to make our final panel of distinguished speakers' job even more difficult, they'll have to follow that performance. But we have challenged them with the task of making some comments that will try to help us come to some sort of conclusion for the conference. And the panelists will speak in the order there on the program. First, we have Michael Berrieve, Paternal Family Professor in Literature and the co-director with Janet Line of the Disability Studies Program at Penn State, and so to whom we owe a great deal of thanks for making this conference possible, along with Janet and everyone else planning it. He's the author of many books, but perhaps the most relevant one for these purposes is Life as We Know It, A Father, a Family, and an Exceptional Child. Arthur Kleiman is Esther and Sidney Rabb Professor and Chair, Department of Anthropology, Harvard University, and Professor of Medical Anthropology and Psychiatry, Harvard Medical School. He, too, is the author of many books, including The Illness Narratives, Suffering, Healing, and the Human Condition, and most recently, What Really Matters, Living a Moral Life Amidst Uncertainty and Danger. Margaret Locke is Marjorie Bronfman Professor in Social Studies and Medicine, affiliated with the Department of Social Studies of Medicine and the Department of Anthropology at McGill University. She, too, has written many books, the most recent of them being Twice Dead, Organ Transplants, and the Reinvention of Death. And her current research deals with the circulation of post-genomic knowledge among basic scientists, clinics, families, and society at large, with a particular emphasis on Alzheimer's disease. So, Michael.
I'm not even going to try to follow that. Wonderful job, though. Peter, you have a future. It's really. I'm going to start instead by making a few remarks about disability and narrative, since that's come up a number of times over the course of the last couple of days, and then go on a couple of tangents from there. I think there are myriad and complex connections between disability and narrative. For one obvious reason, narrators who are haunted by the fear of not being able to narrate themselves any longer. And if you think of how many functions of mind it takes to be able to tell a coherent narrative of yourself or others, the conclusion is sort of self-evident. And the things we've heard over the last couple of days about people who feel that narrating themselves is central to their sense of self. Two, and perhaps less obvious, disability requires a narrative, partly by way of the inconceivably rude question, how did you get that way? Whether it's a question of having lost an arm or a limb of some kind, or a question of a disease trajectory, in which case we're talking about etiologies. I think Ralph referenced this when he spoke of critics of his book wanting that moment of diagnosis, right? How can you have the narrative at the moment of diagnosis? For me, it was people asking, where was the why me God moment? And the fact that I didn't have a why me God moment somehow, I didn't fulfill that narrative requirement. But that seems to be part of the expected trajectory of narrative and disability. I might add here that there's another connection as well that occurred to me today, that Roman Jakobson's famous essay on 2 types of aphasia actually starts from that problematic word selection in patients he'd interviewed, and gave us a theory of metaphor and metonymy that basically generated a whole branch of structuralist literary theory that dominated the next 40 or 50 years. So disability at the core of that as well. Finally, and this has come up, Janet touched on it as well in her presentation, very interesting relations between experimental narrative and disability. Narratives that themselves seem dysfunctional in one way or another. If you go back, say, over the opening opening sentences of Benji's section of The Sound and the Fury, they are not hard to understand. They are very simple sentences, but something is wrong with the narrative, and you can't quite put your finger on what. It doesn't have a sense of temporality, that we know, but even sentence to sentence, there is something missing. Now, I came upon this not only by way of Faulkner, but by remarking that when I read Mark Haddon's The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, it struck me as eerily similar to some of the works of Samuel Beckett, especially Watt. And it occurred to me as well that there's other forms of experimental narrative, the so-called self-conscious fiction we've had from Don Quixote forward, where what's happening there is that narrative is mimicking, or you could say enacting, the self-reflexivity of mind itself. The narrative is conscious of its own status as a narrative. When you combine that with a sort of either a dysfunctional narrative or a narrative about disability, I think you find incredibly fruitful and rich correspondences. So first of all, this is what you get when you have a disability studies program run by 2 literature professors. Which then provokes the question, why have a disability studies program have a conference on Alzheimer's at all? So let me back up for a moment. Partly is that Chet Ballinger is our friend and colleague. But it's also that we wanted to take up the question of disability and disease, disability and medicine, for specific reasons. One, again, obvious, we are interested, I think it was remarked that this, let's see, Arthur remarked this, that this actually is taking place under the auspices of an ethics institute. Well, yeah, we were interested in the ethics of care and the ethics of surrogacy. These things have been hovering at the margins, surrogacy, I think, hovering at the margins of the conference for the past 2 days, care right at the center. But I also think, a little more polemically, that disability studies has yet to come to terms with disease, whatever that might mean. The relation between disability and disease is still indeterminate and undetermined. And what I mean by that is this. I could say that for Janet and for me, the motto of our program is ambivalence are us. Ambivalence about biotech, ambivalence about psychopharmacology, ambivalence about the now classic distinction between disability and impairment, and ambivalence about the whole discourse of social construction that follows from that classic distinction. And here I have to pause a moment because I'm glad the conference is ending where it is, because I've been just keeping notes for this thing and I've run out of paper, so let me see where I go next from there. Oh yes, a little more on that ambivalence. One, while, and I don't want to trope off the deaf, I think Janet's cautions about that are entirely right. But we have the disability studies skepticism toward discourses of the fix and the cure. And if you take as your model cochlear implants, you understand why. At the same time, and we emphasize palliative care over against that magic bullet theory. And I think Peter was entirely right, even under difficult rhetorical circumstances 2 nights ago, to say the discourse of a cure is irresponsible to some people who may actually have wanted to hear it. On the other hand, we have no nostalgia for disease. We have no Smallpox Preservation Society or Polio Appreciation League. And I think, well, that is funny. Is a question of what kinds of things require an attitude of palliative care and which things are, in fact, best cured in ways that are sort of unambiguously universal species-wide goods. This is what I mean about disability studies not quite having come to terms with disease. So, in that spirit, let me, there's 2 other things, right. One, the relation, disability studies in medicine and us. First of all, about the encounter you've just seen. Things you already know. The relation between that encounter and this conference is not straightforward. It is not as if something was discovered and then led to us. On the contrary, the history of Alzheimer's seems tailor-made for history of science. The other thing, and I'd like, this again in the spirit of ambivalence, to recall Janet, not Janet Lyon, but Janet from Talk Back, Move Forward, who asked for a moment of thankfulness to Dr. Alzheimer for allowing us a discourse in which we would say something other than grandma is just gaga. here I want to invoke Eric Engstrom's talk from yesterday morning, long ago yesterday morning, and especially his phrase where he puts emphasis on the anticipatory nature of this discourse. I think that sort of hermeneutic ambivalence is appropriate, because otherwise, just on its own, it looks pretty brutal. It looks like an interrogation. It looks like exactly the kind of interrogation we've been told not to have over the past 2 days, where it's nothing but factual questions, rapid fire, one after the other, sometimes one after one of the same thing, and you can see actually that Alzheimer is perseverating. But I think if we take a look at the anticipatory nature of this discourse, I love this phrase, we also see hermeneutically how it has constructed us. And here's what I mean. It is, I think, in some ways unambiguously, a good thing that we move the discourse of Alzheimer's from the realm of demonic possession or excessive masturbation to a biochemical or neurophysical process. Every kind of move we make that takes it out of the realm of the spiritual or the moral and into the scientific looks, on the whole, like a good thing. But here's the more ambivalent part, two things about that. One, demoralization of disease in this way, I mean de-moralization, where it is no longer a question of moral depravity or sort of a full-blown Otto Weininger kind of theory of degeneration, and simply a matter instead of plaques and tangles, right? Or in the case of Down syndrome, not a question of what Janet or I did, either in utero or propitiating the spirits, but of simple chromosomal non-disjunction. We're sort of generally in favor of things that don't provide guilt to parents where it is completely undeserved. Then two curious things happen. Steve Zarrett mentioned one of them Thursday night. You move from the 70s, where you get, thank goodness, it's a disease with a name, and not some sort of criminal pathology or moral failing, to a re-stigmatization over the past 30 years, over the past couple decades, and in the course of research into the causes of Alzheimer's disease, a sort of weird remoralization of the disease as we turn our attention to people who haven't exercised enough, who haven't done the 10 brain things you're asked to do on one of the brochures outside. So in a weird way, I think Chloe touched on this in her presentation, a sort of return in autism to blaming parents, not in the mode of Bruno Bettelheim, but for failing to adapt. So the possibility for remoralization is always there. It looks at first like moving into the scientific realm takes it out of the moral realm, and it does it only for a little while, and then a new moral realm shows up. Thing two, about the discourse of the spectrum. On the one hand, this is mainly addressed to Peter. Actually, no, it's mainly addressed to everybody. On the one hand, and I've gotten embroiled in one of these exchanges recently. I've told a couple people over the course of the last couple of days. I had just published an essay in the Toronto Globe and Mail about prenatal screening. The occasion for their asking me to do this was that they believed, over the Globe and Mail, that a new test had been found that would detect autism in utero. And not knowing one thing from another, I said, oh, no, there hasn't. They said, oh, yes, there has. I said, no. And this went on for quite a while. And I at first said, the idea of a genetic test for autism doesn't sound any more plausible to me, again, than a test for demonic possession. It isn't that kind of thing that can be reduced to a simple gene sequence. Excuse me. In fact, the only avenue in I had, I got to sort of compromise on the wording of this essay, was to say it is a spectrum. It isn't one thing or the other. However, okay, on one hand, this breaks down the simple opposition between the normal and the pathological, the healthy and disease, or Steve's remarks, replacing the normal and the pathological with the functional and dysfunctional. And these are all, again, good things. Spectrum, good thing. On the other hand, paradoxically, it opens the door to the discovery of a seemingly infinite regression of pre-syndromes and early pre- and mild stages, and thereby incentives for more pharmacological investments. And I think Noel Ballantyne testified to this in a sort of excruciatingly vivid way this morning, where he was first skeptical about prescribing drugs to people with early stages of Alzheimer's, then finds, it seems to be quite effective in 1 of 4. That's all you need, right? And what if you were told? Well, may not do anything, but 1 in 4 seems to respond. Are you going to take the chance that you're going to be one of the 3 of 4? No, and that's how a new drug gets marketed, with the best of intentions. My point is that there's no event, and this is an obvious point again, but I'm going to return to this encounter. No event, no development, subsequent development in the etiology of the sort of social etiology of the disease, or the social etiology of disability, whose trajectory is immanent in the event itself. This is why it's so hard to tell what progress it is, either politically or scientifically. This looks again like a very harsh interrogation. It looks as if, as Eric's paper pointed out, we had here a doctor caught up in the politics of psychiatric cadavers. But it also opened an avenue that eventually led to a new branch of medical knowledge, that's the traditional view, or a new biomedical industry, which would be the cynical view. But the establishment of that branch of knowledge and that industry, in turn, has produced new contradictions. Now, as I close with this, I hope you'll forgive the phrase, but I think it is tangles all the way down. Thanks.
Forgive me if I'm going to read this, but I want to cover a lot of ground in a short space. I will say at the start that what you just saw of Alzheimer's approach to his patient was almost indistinguishable from the way I was trained to do psychiatry in the early 1970s in Boston. So you want to keep that in mind. In this roundtable, we've been asked to reflect on what we can learn from the Augusta D case 100 years after Alzheimer's quote-unquote discovery of the disease. In that vein, I'd like to begin with a quote from Augusta as recorded by Alzheimer in a case file published this year in The Lancet. "I have lost myself." Alzheimer notes that she repeats this phrase when she is asked to write Mrs. Augusta D. and finds herself unable to remember what to write after Mrs. To the contemporary reader, as well as many review authors, this phrase, "I have lost myself," encapsulates one sense of the cruelty of Alzheimer's disease as precisely the premature and uncontrollable loss of self. But as so many speakers at this conference have shown, it is not so much the loss of self, but rather profound transformations of individual subjectivity and the grounds of interrelatedness that characterize the illness experience of Alzheimer's. What I want to do is to talk about the losses and transformations that characterize the lived reality of Alzheimer's and really any serious disorder in terms of moral experience, suggesting that this lens allows us to be attentive to what is at stake both for the individuals and families reckoning with Alzheimer's, and for North American society more broadly as we begin to shape the next 100 years of research and practice in this area and more generally. I'll begin with the idea of moral experience, which I developed more extensively in my Tanner lectures and in my book, What Really Matters, and then return to the subject of Alzheimer's disease, suggesting ways in which this framework might productively move our discussions forward. Experience is made up of the flow of interactions between people living in what anthropologists have called local worlds. By a local world, I refer not only to the traditional anthropological imaginary of the ethnographer's village, but also to the range of connections and communities that characterize contemporary times. These may be, as they are so often in our globalized era, transcontinental networks. Within any given local world, life is by definition a social intersubjective experience, lived among others. It is in these interactions with others, within a given local world, that experience may be described as the flow of our engagements. Experience is therefore not limited to the individual, but understood as intersubjective, interpersonal. Experience is also always moral, because there are things deeply at stake for the person, the network, and the local world. Because these are things most at stake for each of us, whether they are particular or whether they are widely shared concerns, all of our lives are serious undertakings. These widely shared concerns are easily recognizable in the world, and they include material resources, religious commitments, close relationships, the self, and life itself. Although many of these fundamental concerns are shared across societies, undoubtedly culturally distinct issues are also at stake in any particular local world. There are also threats to what is most at stake that constitute the source of social danger in our lives. Just say as an aside, and I agree here fully with Brian Turner, that the failure of the social sciences to seriously engage the seriousness of life has made most of the social sciences and the humanities merely ornamental. In all societies, danger is a central part of what it means to be human. Key words like endurance, survival, making do, doing what is necessary to get on indicate how important danger is in people's lives and in all activities that make up our social world. In our contemporary world, these dangers often take the very intimate form of threats to the body. For all the medical breakthroughs of the last 50 years, most people are aware that many health problems are incurable, and most of us will face the pain and limitations of chronic conditions. Coping with Alzheimer's disease in particular brings this danger front and center, forcing individuals and families to face limits of our control over our small worlds and even our inner selves. What makes experience moral is precisely the reality of these dangers. In the face of this uncertainty and uncontrollability, there are things that are profoundly at stake for individuals and communities. These may be health, vigor, family, interconnection, professional and monetary success, many other things, but discoverable things. It is in this sense of profound and irreducible stakes, rather than in a normative understanding, that I draw on the term moral to describe lived experience. The fact that what is at stake for the individual and the family may be at odds with what matters most to the community brings a political pressure to bear on emotions. Today, right now, I want to focus on two aspects of moral experience: that of individuals living with Alzheimer's and that of caregivers. Although for conceptual clarity, I have separated these two categories, these moral experiences, like all experiences, are deeply intersubjective. That is, caregivers and people with Alzheimer's share a local moral world and are deeply interconnected in their responses. When thinking theoretically through these issues, I, like many people, also reflect on my personal experience, on myself and my wife Joan, and our experiences of dealing with her neurodegenerative disorder, or our neurodegenerative disorder. As my title indicates, people with Alzheimer's disease are faced with profound threats to their worlds, and for what is at stake for them as individuals and social beings. They must reckon with a profound shift in personhood, not only because of the biological course of the disease, but also because of its implications for others, for how others relate to them. People are faced with the slow loss of who they once were in both large and small ways. From the loss of the professional careers and identities to the mundane acts of self-care and self-presentation, they are faced with new ways of negotiating the world. This has important implications for moral experience, as so many of the things that are in flux because of the disease process are aspects of identity and experience that are deeply at stake. It is in these irreducible moments that the dangerous reality of existence is visible. Caregivers experience a similar shift in their local moral worlds. In this first-hand experience of powerlessness in the face of continuing danger, they too must rework how to live in the world. Stakes change and are reevaluated. In the midst of this profound struggle, there are moments of connection and interdependence as people are forced to reach out in new ways. Another important aspect of caregiver experience is their confrontation of a chronic degenerative disease within a medical system that hypes technical rational control. From physicians to disease advocacy groups, the focus around Alzheimer's is on the newest biomedical intervention, which is seen to lead to the elusive cure. New research is hyped in the popular media. Chat boards on websites spread information about the newest study or controlled trial. Friends and families all hold out for a magic solution. But caregiver reality is none of these things. It is marked by day-to-day attempts to cope with a radically shifting home life that remakes relationships and identity. In the midst of all the biological hype, there are few resources for how to approach these life-altering shifts in experience. And I say that in light of everything we heard today. I would still say, from my own personal experience, there are few resources for how to approach these life-altering experiences. This hyping of technical rational control in the face of the uncontrollable danger of Alzheimer's does a great disservice to families and people living with Alzheimer's in three important ways. And by the way, this is not just about Alzheimer's. This is about cancer, it's about heart disease, it's about every disease. First and foremost, it's misleading. The discourse surrounding new treatments and research hypes control. The genuine reality of illness and social life more broadly is that this kind of control is unattainable. Alzheimer's may be a limit case because the claims are totally out of proportion with the real interventions on the ground. Secondly, this hype diverts attention from other important aspects of illness experience. One of the core issues for people dealing with neurodegenerative disease is coping strategies. In comparison to biomedical research, where the resources are vast, there is very little resource made available in this area. Finally, this technical rational discourse acts as a masking language that interferes with the human reality of such a personally devastating process. Alzheimer's, like many life-altering diseases, touches what is profoundly at stake for us in the world, destabilizes deep truths, and makes uncomfortable core realities. It forces us to face explicitly questions of who we are, how we relate, and how we live in relationships with others. I believe it's actually the threat of this that produces in turn a counter-discourse that at times is trivial and at other times is exaggerated in terms of issues of control and the newness of interventions and the like. The topics discussed at this conference mark an important step, and I've very much enjoyed the topics discussed here and how they've been discussed, towards addressing the core moral experience in Alzheimer's and more generally. In the next 100 years of research, we can only hope and work for an approach that takes seriously these moral dimensions of Alzheimer's disease, laying the conceptual framework for new kinds of practice of social support on the ground and dealing with the realities for real people. Now, in this regard, I just wanted to leave with an example of the kinds of realities that could be advanced and enable medicine and families. And I base this on the interaction we've just seen here. There's something terribly wrong with the interaction we see between Alzheimer's and this patient. And I think the best reflection of what's wrong here comes from the work of Emmanuel Levinas, the great French theologian and moralist, who said that ethics should precede epistemology, that the fundamental human act of the face-to-face is to affirm, to acknowledge the other, that is the first act. Following that, there can be all kinds of acts, but that's the critical act, to affirm the other and where they are. And I would say that is exactly what we see lacking in Dr. Alzheimer's approach to Augusta D. And I can say it's lacking in most of medical approaches, even today. Okay? I spend a lot of time in medical settings, and I can tell you, you'd be hard-pressed to find on a regular basis an affirmation or acknowledgement of the other as the initial act, the initial therapeutic act. So I would say that a number of wonderful things have come out of this meeting. One of them is to show that Alzheimer's may be difficult to deal with, but it's good to think. And we've had a terrific range of ideas brought out here, which I would say, if you wanted to encapsulate them in my own mind, it's how the medical, the moral, and the political are completely inseparable. Take that back into the laboratory for researchers. Bring that into the clinic. Take it into the classroom. Secondly, that social construction is possible and is significant and serious, but you cannot construct out of life anything you want. There is something in experience that resists construction, And I think we saw that actually in this wonderful play that was presented to us today. And the last point I want to make is just how bloody difficult life is. Life is tough and difficult to understand and difficult to go through. God, I've had a golden career. Everything good in my profession has happened to me and in my personal life. And I can tell you that my life is a very, very difficult life. It's true of every single one of us. How is it then that dimension, that experiential dimension of life, appears so unoften in our work?
Sure, I can start while you're on your knees. Absolutely. I would like to start by reiterating what many people have said increasingly over the course of the last 2 days, and it does seem like a long time ago, and in fact it was 3 days ago, that this has been an absolutely marvelous conference. I came with high expectations, seeing the names listed there, and I think that you have all done an absolutely fabulous job, and I presume this is going forward to some form of publication. I think it could be a very, very significant piece when it comes out. And in part, I think that the rich pickings are due to exactly what Jess had intended. Thank you very much. The interdisciplinarity and I would switch to transdisciplinarity like Peter. I find it easier to say, for one thing. But the fact that we have this represented in the speakers in all the different ways. Don't read this, I'm not there yet. It's fine. If I hadn't even paid attention to it has been really fruitful and really, really rewarding. And of course the papers have brought us up to date on many areas of research and in the Alzheimer's world, particularly the kind of research that doesn't normally get reported, and the personal experiences and the caregiving aspects which aren't reported widely. It's marvellous to be brought up to date with these kinds of innovative approaches that are clearly taking place. I've taken part in Alzheimer's support groups quite a bit, but even doing those kinds of things, you're not exposed systematically to all these exciting developments that are taking place. I want to look first of all at the aspect of the conference in which the question of self and selves is addressed, the title of the conference. Clearly that too comes out in the presentation, the wonderful bit of dramaturgy that we just had, but the whole theme of all the papers right the way through, many of them have addressed this question of untangling selfhood. They've taken up the challenge that we were asked to do. And the tone, for me, the tone of the conference was set on the first night at the round table, and I thought there were many take-home messages, but there were two particularly notable ones. The first being the very last comment made by Peter, as often is the case, which is that this is indeed a condition that can strike any one of us. None of us should feel we're off the hook with this. It should be of great concern to us all. But what I would add is that I think we have a challenge even in getting that recognized in our kind of society. I'm going to say our, I am a Canadian, but for the sake of simplification, we are North Americans. Most of us are sitting in this room, some of us are Europeans, and some of us are perhaps from somewhere else. But anyway, let me just collectivize us, if I may. I think that there will be problems getting this recognized as something that is of concern to us all because of our ongoing emphasis on youth and on the indifference of youth, and it's partly of our own making, to the elderly and to difficulties of chronic disease and diseases of disability, the whole range of stuff. It just doesn't fit with the overall themes of the dominant culture in North America and many parts of Europe. So I think that's something that has to be worked on, and clearly it is being worked on when we've heard quite a bit, especially on that first night, about intergenerational mixing very deliberately and consistently, something that has been happening is that better? Something that's been happening consistently in Denmark and in Japan for a very long time, and which we finally seem to be waking up to taking on as a good approach. Secondly, what became clear right from that very first evening was that while the so-called past self, as Stephen Post put it a long time ago, does indeed gradually diminish but not disappear, I would argue, and I think many would agree, the present self or selves can be nourished through music and storytelling, through loving care, through jokes, and so on. And this present self, as several of the conference papers showed over the course of the last 2 days so beautifully, can and indeed should, I believe, incite self-reflection in family members, in caregivers, and hopefully among academics and the public at large when they're vicariously exposed to these kinds of stories and encounters. And I think Eleanor's paper, of course, was an absolutely fabulous example of the way in which that can be done in a moving way which must surely touch the hearts of just about everyone. My earlier work, as you've just heard, was to do with death-like conditions, brain death, and I had a lot of exposure to patients with persistent vegetative state. And even patients in persistent vegetative state, it's quite clear they respond to stimulation. Not all of them, but a good number do indeed respond to stimulation, and particularly to music, to thermal pools, to stimulation on the skin of various kinds. And a few do actually reverse and gradually recover. Again, not many, but without that stimulation there is no hope. It won't happen. The AD brain, as we've all made, well, as you have all made clear repeatedly, is not going to recover. At least we have no way of coming to terms there's no justification for us to think that that is going to be the case in the near future, and probably is unlikely to be in the distant future. But clearly what we're seeing is that that appreciating and nurturing and locating the present self and selves is indeed the key to good living, as the Cree would say, to being alive well. One can persist and continue being alive well in conditions which are extraordinarily difficult, but with the right kind of care and attention it can be done. So let's get this. Oh, now I've got to go backwards. It doesn't go backwards. We've had this problem before. This is a quote. And I managed, or somebody managed, to leave off where this quote is from. It's out of the New Yorker, but it's Jonathan Franzen writing in the New Yorker, and this later becomes part of his book. I now see my reluctance to apply the term Alzheimer to my father's way of protecting to my father as a way of protecting the specificity of Earl Franzen from the generality of a named condition. Conditions have symptoms. Symptoms point to the organic basis of everything we are. They point to the brain as meat. And where I ought to recognize that, yes, the brain is meat, I seem instead to maintain a blind spot across which I then interpolate stories that emphasize the more soul-like aspects of the self. Clearly, Jonathan Franzen is exhibiting the struggle that has been on the floor for 2 days. The ambivalence that many relatives and caregivers have with respect to the diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. On the one hand, inevitably, we've heard repeatedly in this conference, and clearly many people have first-hand experience of this, it's the soul-like aspects of the self and their gradual diminishment that is so troubling, so unbearable. This loss, the inexorable disappearance of the former person, causes anguish and fear about the future. But it's also fear not about simply the future of the identified patient, but about all of us around that person. But on the other hand, as Franzen clearly recognizes and is uncomfortable about but comes to terms with, his father is a patient whose brain is the target for testing and treatment attempts. As a patient, it is his diminishing cognitive abilities that are significant, together with the appearance of markers in his blood and whatever signs imaging technology may give of incipient neuropathology. no note about the soul in the on the patient's record, probably no note about his diminished social life or changed self, and probably, very scarily indeed, no mention of the patient's mind, simply his scores on the mini mental state examination. I'm going to, obviously, what I have to say will reiterate a little bit some of the things that have been said already, but I was going to refer to one or two things which haven't been brought up. And I think that in this conference we've not focused on this dilemma head on very much. We have chosen and focused powerfully on the side of the dilemma that gets pushed to one side in clinical settings and in laboratories. And I've seen this happen again and again in memory clinics. And many of the papers have worked at bringing back the whole person, the soul side of the experience, as it should be, obviously. Gillian, for example, has highlighted in her paper the relationship of the brain to selves, but rather than dwelling on the specifics of the brain in great detail, she argues forcefully on the basis of her research that when the I has gone, not all is lost by any means. And she's able to show through her research how flexible and how adaptable the brain can be to trauma and to insults in general. It exhibits, she didn't use this word, incredible plasticity. And we know now that even neuronal damage can be repaired to a degree, something that was not recognized until remarkably recently. But without social stimulation, without an environment, a positive environment, and without stimulations of various kinds, this will not happen. Embodied selves are inevitably mediated by language, culture, and experience. And as Woody made clear, the idea of the construct of self varies through time and space. The idea of multiple selves is not foreign in most cultures. In fact, it's the most common way of understanding selves. And further, as Charles Taylor has shown, the emergence of the rational, autonomous, interiorized self is a product of the enlightenment of the West, of Western enlightenment. Woody makes clear that it is this self that today, both morally and medically, are regarded as correct. And the psychological scales and the measurements that we've talked about are indeed part of this approach to understanding the self. It's a dehumanization process that is fundamentally at work when we do this, all this measuring that we can't resist. And as Arthur mentioned, increasingly with technological developments, this self, but he didn't put it this way, but this self is indeed somatized. Mind is conflated with brain, and human behavior crudely linked directly to biomarkers and to brain scans. As Stephen Katz made clear, memory has become the guarantor of the quality of the aging somatized self. All of this was made beautifully clear in the various papers that were presented, and I think this whole theme of the impact of technology, the impact of medicalization is something that cannot be underestimated. And I actually want to say something a bit more about that in a second. Several of the papers dealt in one way or another with the labeling, the categorization, the standardization, the measurement, and the medicalization. And I think it would be, it's absolutely essential that those kind of papers are present. All of these papers show to some degree that or in one way or another, that the heterogeneity of brains, minds, and cells are forced into taxonomic categories in clinics and in laboratories, and even in actually almost especially in epidemiological research, which is something that we didn't actually have a chance to talk about. And Annette's paper shows nicely how this doesn't happen in the same way always in different places. This sort of thing is accomplished in different ways. The boxification, as my colleague Pat Crawford called this kind of thing a long time ago, is of course driven in part by drug company interests. We've mentioned this many times. And we do indeed do medicine by numbers. Inevitably, people are going to be diminished through these practices. And then Peter brings up this really important point, which many of his neurological colleagues are already disagreeing with him. And he's a very brave man to stand out and make these statements. The question of whether we are indeed actually dealing with something that could be called normal aging, that if we don't set out the age range, if we don't go for the usual relationship of age to aging, if we undo that tight link, then we can begin to look at things in a different way. And in order to the question of whether indeed we are dealing with something which is highly pathological, or whether we are dealing with an extension or one extreme of normality, is something that really does have to be asked very seriously. In order to locate prodromal or incipient sites of change in this brain, medicalization takes place earlier and earlier and earlier, as we've also talked about. We didn't have a paper on mild cognitive impairment, but it was referred to. I've watched people receive their diagnosis of mild cognitive impairment, and I've never seen such a bunch of angry patients, really furious patients. And even more scary, very often the partner or caregiver who, well, it's not that people don't have caregivers when they're mild cognitive impairment, but the partner or a family member who brought them in would be in opposition to the identified person. They would insist that indeed things are wrong. The person would be sitting there resisting. Ian Hacking's concern about what he calls the looping effects are clearly at work. And as we've seen, it's just about in just about all of these papers, once a constellation of behaviors becomes labeled and medicalized, then doctors, caregivers, the patients themselves respond to the label and all its many associations. And Anne Basting's exercise with us in the library last night made it clear how the beginnings of how this kind of thing works, as did her wonderful film. Okay, I also definitely want to say that we can't understand where we are today without paying serious attention to history. Alzheimer's happens to be the disease that provides one of the most interesting historical examples, but it's essential to really take this history very, very seriously. And the marvelous papers by Eric and Jess demonstrated this so well. That Kraepelin was interested in the health of populations was something that I didn't know, perhaps many others did, and it clearly is of great significance. I mean, we begin to see at once the links between what Agamben calls zones of exclusion created in asylums and to a degree in clinics, and the systematic monitoring of and experimentation on human subjects and the links with eugenics. But at the same time, we have to be very careful not to practice presentism on the past, and Eric highlights this in his paper in what I think is the most interesting way, which has already been mentioned, by stressing the excitement associated with science and scientific discovery, the moment of anticipation for a bright future, and the hope of overcoming dementia, feeble-mindedness, and all these other horrible conditions that the doctor hopes to beat. Science will prevail. So I just want to finish by, I'm going to show you 4 more slides very quickly. They're pictures. But first I just want to point out something that I've been working on and feel quite concerned about. We've been talking almost exclusively in this conference, aside from the historical papers, about the condition of Alzheimer's, the experience of Alzheimer's, and the management of Alzheimer's. One thing that we haven't talked about at all is the question of causation. And this is something which is not talked about in the clinics, and people, when they go to clinics, don't ask their doctors what they think caused the problem, not in connection with this particular disease. It's pretty unusual. However, there's a lot of work, and I think it was Arthur that alluded to it, or maybe it was Peter who alluded to the work that has been done on toxic environments, particularly, it was Peter, toxic environments, particularly lead and other chemicals in the environment, which are increasingly present as part of our daily life and the productions that we put out. There's research coming down the pipeline which is looking increasingly solid about the impact of these toxins on neurophysiological development from utero on, the impact on before birth, the huge impact on childhood, and lifelong effects of these kinds of things. We focused a lot on individuals, but Arthur, in his presentation just now, alluded to the way in which there has been a de-emphasizing in some respects of the political. The remoralization of this disease should certainly not have gone the way it went, which is to argue for more self-care and more exercise and more crossword puzzles and all that rubbish, which we should all be, I mean, you know, we don't have to all do exercise, crosswords, we should probably all be exercising, but it's for many, many reasons. But it should focus, it should be re-politicized and re-moralized in terms of a politics of dementia and all the environmental issues that need to be examined much more closely. I also would just say that when you look at the history of Alzheimer's, it's very clear that the somatized cerebral approach to this disease has in effect been overdetermined, and it's been overdetermined in a way that has been alluded to. There have been anomalies all the way through the history of Alzheimer's disease, and they have been shoved under the rug again and again and again. And it starts from day one with Alzheimer, whose second case did not have tangles, and tangles was his big discovery. But his second case out of 7 cases, was it, didn't have tangles. But, you know, that's just buried. That's buried. Then we come, again, repeatedly, all through the history, you find that the pathology, the autopsies do not correspond with behavioral changes. And the latest ongoing study, which is of great interest, and many of you will know that, is the so-called nuns study. And no time to go into the details, but the autopsies on these nuns as they die show very clearly that in a good number of cases, their behavioral changes do not correspond to the plaques and tangles and the cell loss in their brain. Some of them have a lot of plaques and tangles and cell loss, and they're perfectly normal in daily life, and others have very few plaques and tangles. Most of us in this room have plaques and tangles by now. Some of these nuns have very few, and yet they appear very demented, especially when they do their mini mental state exam. This is not actually being pushed under the rug, but nobody very much talks about it, and the researcher is regarded as a bit of a maverick, partly because he wears a purple jacket. If he stopped wearing a purple jacket, he might do better. I could go on about this, about the anomalies, and there's a need for a Kuhnian paradigm shift in this field, away from so much emphasis on the cerebral, which would incorporate questions about causation and questions about the self after the disease is identified, away from this deeply reductionistic approach. And you see little pushes to destabilize that model, and we haven't got very far with that yet. So I just want to, I hope I'm not dragging on too much, quick pictures just to finish things up here. Some of you may have seen these pictures. This man, William Utermohlen, was actually born in America but lived most of his life in England. He was a portrait artist, and this is a portrait he painted of himself at age 60 before he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I don't know about you, but I sort of feel that this is a man who senses something is coming down the railroad, and you will see that indeed it does. Self-portrait painted 2 years later, and already his sense of proportion, he can't master proportion the way he did. You see his Van Goghian ear, and the juxtaposition of certain angles is absolutely inappropriate. At this stage, at age 62, he knows that he can't do what he wants to do, and he's very frustrated. Again, at age 62, clearly on a day when he's feeling bad, it would appear much more abstraction, and many people interpret this as pain and anguish in this portrait. Another one at 62, this is a pencil drawing which allows him to increase the abstraction. Some people have argued that this becomes Picasso-like, but this isn't the intention of this artist. And yet, it is perhaps possible to argue that a kind of creativity is released through the changes in his brain, which gets closer to what we've just heard in the last session on autism. And this at 64, where he's back to the more standard, temporarily it seems, to the more standard form of self-portrait, but as you see, the proportions are just lost. And he doesn't want that. He wants a more traditional form of self-portrait. And this one is undated. So I just wanted to finish with those because some of us have complained a tiny bit that we didn't hear perhaps quite enough about the dark side of this disease. There was a lot of wonderfully, wonderfully uplifting presentations, especially the ones dealing with self and patients who have actually been diagnosed. But there is also a horror. What was Arthur's phrase? An existential. What did you say, Arthur? An existential catastrophe, which is again, as you said in your talk, something that we haven't dwelt on much at all. Okay, thank you.
We do have time for some comments and questions, if our panelists could take a seat up there. And I need to find... Mike? Arthur? Margaret? Do you have time?
That one.
I was cleaning a break room at work the other day, and I found this article in Newsweek, an interesting article on Alzheimer's and exercise.
That's the current Newsweek?
It's fairly recent,
Okay.
the last couple of weeks.
Okay. Thank you.
So that ball fixes it?
With respect to that, that's part of the remoralization and the horrific. There's a colleague in sociology who, two colleagues who study aging, but they study successful aging. And so you can't get sick, you can't get Alzheimer's, you can't have a difficult time, you avoid all the existential catastrophes, and then you're successful. Otherwise, it's your damn fault for not aging successfully.
I want to thank the panel, all three of you, really fantastic summaries. I'm going to take these home and think about them for a long, long time. I wanted to ask you a kind of broad question that I think about all the time when I wear my hat as somebody involved in women's health, which is, why do we have such a difficult time treating difference as difference without saying one kind of difference is better than another kind of difference? Why, as humans, can't we live in that space that just says it is?
Well, I can't answer that question. All I can say is that this has a history as long as that of humankind, and it's not obviously just gender issues, but all of the stuff that we know so well. And it's something that we've been trying hard to deal with, and have postulated semi-mythological societies where these kinds of things don't happen, and when you go and investigate, of course they happen. It seems something that is going to be very, very, very hard to overcome. I mean, I'm a child of the 60s in Berkeley and the 70s, and we thought we'd broken through for a few weeks there, and then it seemed for a good number of decades after that a lot of really fundamental changes had taken place, and indeed they did. But here we are back with, I'll pick the obvious one. We've got young women tripping around on heels this high, and where the heck does that come from? Why don't they accept the equalities that were made for them in a way that we would like them to? This high is fine. This high is not fine.
Do you want to say anything about life being difficult and suffering? I mean,
I don't want to go down just as associated with that. Let me just say that my former friend and late neighbor, the great historical sociologist Barrington Moore, wrote a wonderful book called Hierarchy and Inequality, in which he showed that with the exception of the limited number of small-scale pre-literate societies, all other societies that we know have hierarchy and inequality, and that these play out in different ways. You've asked one example of how this plays out. One of the most interesting examples is really how under the regime of global capitalism that we're under right now, how prosperity advances and inequality widens very substantially. And the two great cases of this are China, where I do most of my research, in India. And there you see, by the way, that the kinds of concerns you have are very, very real in terms of the problems that are deepening.
I'm going to do ambivalence again. I'm going to start, don't know any other mode. I'm going to start with sort of an ethical question. When I first published something about Jamie, it was 1994, he was about 2-3 years old, and the first draft included a line from his older brother, Nick. It was from an occasion in which his kindergarten class was having, everything was transformed into a pirate ship for the day, and they were all, and they had the parents in for pirate lunch or whatever. And Janet came in with then infant Jamie, and one of the other mothers said, "Oh, no, baby," and Janet says, "Yes, he has Down syndrome," and the gasp was just audible across the entire room. And Nick turned to her, and the way I put it was with a fine mixture of reassurance and disdain, "He's perfectly all right." Here's the ethical moment. The ethical moment is that Nick read that when he was 8 and said, he didn't want that in there. And I said, "Why not?" And he said, it makes me look like a know-it-all. Which was especially, a very sensitive remark for an 8-year-old, and I honored his wishes, but then I got oral use for the rest of his life, and mine, so that I can narrate not only his original assurance, but his qualms about it's being repeated in print. And I told him at the time, "No, you did exactly the right thing. This is a woman who certainly needed to hear that Jamie was perfectly all right." Now, at the same time, of course, he wasn't. I think one of the reasons for the sort of therapeutic mode we sometimes fall into with regard to disability and disease is that there is this backdrop of tragedy and so someone suffers from Down syndrome. It is now entirely politically incorrect to say someone suffers from Down syndrome. Jamie does not suffer from it. At the same time, there are people who suffer from Alzheimer's and suffer terribly. That dialogue winds up, of course, with one of the participants screaming for hours, and not a dialogue at all. So I think it's worth taking that into consideration. The question is, what forms of difference are perfectly ordinary? On the bell curve of every available human variation, from height to eye color or whatever, what things are perfectly ordinary and don't require the whole logics of abjection? But one thing about logic of abjection, I thought immediately of Michael Warner's book Trouble with Normal, right? In which he argues against gay marriage on the grounds that basically you don't need to bundle all these social privileges under the heading of marriage. And one thing that is going to happen if you make gay marriage available is that all the gay and lesbian folks who don't want to get married will be abjected all the more. They must be really aberrant. And yet, even in that book, as he suggests something more like civil unions or a variety of cohabitations, I thought that doesn't get rid of the logic of abjection. It disperses it. But imagine people who want no such relation whatsoever. What happens to them? There's always this residuum. And I'll go back to what Janet said about mental retardation being the end point of logic of abjection. I followed into it also. I tried to demonstrate that Jamie knows a great deal about sharks and the Beatles. What does that do to people with really quite severe and profound disabilities who can't make that same sort of demonstration? There remains always this residuum. And I hate to think that the logic of abjection is built into everything but these pre-literate societies, but, tempting thought.
I have, I guess, more of a comment than a question, but I'm thinking about the theme that keeps coming up about stressing the positive and acknowledging the negative. And Margaret, when I heard you say we need a Kuhnian paradigm shift, I flashed on a book I've just been teaching, Feyerabend's Against Method. And I thought, we don't need a paradigm shift. What we need is to see that, as he puts it, anything goes. If you think you know what works scientifically, actually, if you trace it out, we don't know what works scientifically. We should try anything. And it seems interesting that in the end of that book, what he does is he assesses the entire scientific field, looks at how transculturally it has been used to oppress, and he turns to theater. He leaves the field and he goes into theater. So I'm thinking, there's something about bringing the tragedy and the comedy forward together, and that theatrical exploration and that humility.
We have a few minutes before we're threatened with death.
Objection.
Any other comments or questions?
This is mostly a question for Margaret Locke, but I'd like to hear from all of you. I am curious, actually, about why there is so little conversation about causation regarding Alzheimer's, in contrast to many, many other, certainly diseases, maybe also disabilities. I liked that comment, by the way, about bringing disability studies into conversation with disease. And I guess if you're willing, I'd love to hear you expand on that concept of thinking about a political remoralization of Alzheimer's disease, and whether there's an element of this in the autism community that I know more about, as whether there's a sense that if we talk about environmental causation and injury, that's out of necessity somehow invalidating arguments about acceptance and accommodation, whether there's a sense that the second we bring injury into the conversation, we're somehow making it impossible to talk about valuing people as individuals, including their disorder or disability. So I know that's like 3 separate things, but if you could speak to any of them, I'd really appreciate it.
I think this is perhaps where some of the parallels, the remarkable parallels between autism and Alzheimer's breaks down a little bit, and because we're dealing with the other end of the life cycle, some of what you said doesn't apply in quite the same way. I've done a lot of interviewing now with families where Alzheimer's is present, and part of the interviewing has been designed explicitly to ask them what they think about causation, what caused your mother's illness, and so on and so on. And in fact, it's clear that these people have multi-causal explanations ranging from all over the place, even the group that Peter knows all too well, who have been coached to understand about the ApoE gene and Alzheimer's. Even this group will come up with multi-causal explanations. None of them think the gene causes the disease, and none of them think their personality causes, or that aluminum causes it all by itself. Aluminum won't go way, and the environment. They all have multi-causal explanations. But by the time that doesn't translate into what is being done in the world of epidemiology and the world of clinical science and in laboratories. And there's another anomaly which I didn't mention, and I'll just mention it very quickly, and that is that the epidemiological evidence does suggest very, very strongly that this disease is not distributed equally across populations. And that's not just to do with genetic variation, it's to do with what is labeled as educational differences, that people with less education are more vulnerable to this disease. And when I've talked to brilliant clinicians about this, they say, oh, it's because they don't have so many synapses. And I roll my eyes, and we can't get much further with that conversation. And it's to do with not having cerebral reserve. Now that gets them closer to this, what I find a much, much stronger argument, is to exposure to numerous things, not just toxins, but to certain environments and certain lifestyles, lack of decent food, all the basic stuff that's been going on all the time, which is just beginning to emerge at the major Alzheimer's conferences. But the crowds don't pack those sessions.
In terms of causality, you don't have to worry about this because everything we've learned the cause of in terms of disease has not diminished the issues, the human issues, but if anything intensified it. Just think of HIV/AIDS from 81 through to the present. Think of tuberculosis, the long history of tuberculosis. Think more recently of breast cancer. So I don't think there is that is to be feared. And you can make a more general statement that I think is important to look at because it can be well documented in the literature now, and that is that the more we've learned biologically about disorders, the more interesting social and humanistic issues become. I think that's. And I want to make a last point that has nothing to do with this question you just let me make, and that is that I think what we're doing here is what I would call the medical humanities. And I am a deep believer in the medical humanities. Homi Bhabha, head of our Humanities Center, started a program on, and that I'm very much involved with. And I think that the connection of the humanities and the social sciences, and the more interpreted humanistic social sciences especially, with them to medicine is one of the more promising developments of our time, and I think it now showed me, since I knew virtually nothing about Alzheimer's in terms of the literature in the field, other than the personal experience, it showed me how important this area is for the medical humanities. I also want to say just a thank you to all of you in the following way that I'm your basic scholar, and I read like anyone else widely. I avoided reading anything on Alzheimer's after my wife disorder started, and I avoided any kind of conference in this area. The reason I came to this conference, I think, is really nothing to do with the topic. Frankly, is that my son is and so but I want to tell you that this was personally an immensely important conference for me. It broke through a barrier. Not only informed me, but I think has prepared me to move ahead thinking about this field. Now, I have always in the past chosen my fields carefully, so because with two giants of my field, microbiology, already in this field, Margaret and Louis, I thought there was no space for me. But now I'm thinking maybe there'd be a little bit of space.
I can't possibly follow that. I'm just going to do things where I can't possibly follow. I just want to point out that those quite moving remarks help to underscore the point that otherwise wouldn't follow, that the whole search for cause, I think, is politically and intellectually indeterminate. Again, it goes back to what I was saying a few minutes ago. don't know what the event carries with it, right? And what its future history will be. At the same time, I do think we flinch in disability studies when the question of cause comes up, and that's for two reasons. One, it seems inevitably, it doesn't go down the lead road, it doesn't go down the environmental road, it goes down to blaming people for drinking out of aluminum cans, which is what my sister will do if I am diagnosed with Alzheimer's. I just know this is going to happen. She's been on my case for 10 years about drinking out of aluminum cans. Second, if it's a genetic disorder, the way I put it, for shorthand form, when we hear the word genome, we reach for our guns. We think that too will eventually pathologize and lead, especially in prenatal screening, to a whole new discourse of an apparatus of surveillance and search and destroy, and also a different kind of individualization where you've got eugenics now on the sort of micro level rather than with regard to the macro eugenics involving whole populations. So those two caveats, right? Those I think are the reasons for the flinching: fear of individualization of cause and fear of the geneticization of cause. One final thing. Hate to bring up the enormous North American divide, but it's a completely different thing when you're talking about health insurance provided by employers. The idea that causes would be individualized under a regime where you are then assessed as greater or more severe risk because of your failure to do X number of crossword puzzles or to avoid the aluminum is forbidding, and that's, I think, another reason for the general flinching.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone.